From FlourishDX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers, and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform whole school mental health. Jason, we are back together again. It's like the dynamic duo all over again. And we've had a few weeks apart because of time zone kerfuffles, but I think you're at home and I'm at home. I'm glad we're back together.
Hey, it's been a few weeks, Tamara. I can't say that I've missed it. Sorry, Tamara. I missed you. But it's been pretty crazy last month with a bit of travel and work and whatnot. So it's been nice, but nice to be back and nice to catch up with you.
Thank you. I'm glad you missed me, if not the space. And will you share with our listeners, in case they haven't been listening to your other podcasts, the exciting things that you have going on in the psych health and safety space?
There's a number of things that we're doing. So we're starting to work with more large and complex organizations, and we're starting to run some workshops specific for those types of companies. So, we're now working with companies that have over 40,000 employees. So a little bit different to working with a school where you might be catering for maybe a couple of hundred staff at most generally, and, maybe 1,000, 2,000 students for a large school. It's quite unique, the challenges, and we're just working our way through it and, using a mixture of education, technology and consulting to try and get to the outcome that employers want, and that's healthy and happy employees.
Well, I love that. And our guest today has a similar background to you. Nick Holton, Dr. Nick Holton, is a good friend of mine, and he is also familiar with working with large organizations as well as individuals. He helps humans to become better versions of themselves. And I'm going to let him fill you in on his full background, but he has worked with professional athletes, NCAA programs, schools, Fortune 500 businesses, and he also has another podcast. So we've got a lot of listening for our listeners to do. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you both for having me. Pleasure to be here with you.
So, Nick, in 5 minutes or less, can you tell us a bit about your career today?
Sure. Yeah. The short version, although it's not going to sound like it because I'm going to go back to sixth grade and about 12 years old, but it's still the short version. I was a pretty good soccer player, football, if you will, and brought my little sister out into the driveway one day before she had a game. She was, let's say, better at other things than she was at sports. Tried to help her out with a couple tips and tricks. She went out, had a really, really tremendous game, beat up on a boy twice her size. And I just remember kind of watching that and watching her experience some of that joy and thinking, well, that felt like pretty good, right? I was able to use something that I like and am good at, help somebody else level up at things they like and want to be better at. And didn't think much of it at the time. It's more, hindsight is 20/20, but fast forward, by 14, I knew I wanted to spend a lot more time doing that sort of work. I had visited a school with my uncle, who's an athletic director, tremendous guy, great human being. I had awesome relationships with my teachers. So I watched these relationships evolve, thought about some of those interactions with my sister and said, well, hey, I'll probably get a bunch of cracks at having that impact if I go into education. So now we really fast forward and, 15 years of classroom teaching later, education isn't exactly, I think, what most of us hope it is going to be or expect it's going to be as we enter a classroom. And I made, I guess, sort of the two-time folly of thinking I would get better answers if I went to graduate school. So I pursued a master's degree in education, eventually got my PhD in educational psychology. And that was my entry point into the world of optimal performance, human flourishing, well-being, flow, intrinsic motivation, a lot of different things that we can nerd out about. And then I immediately said, okay, we can apply this to just about any context where people are looking to either feel better or perform better, or ideally both. And so that turned into working in and on schools, as well as with organizations, and doing a lot of personal and in addition to group performance or well-being coaching.
Terrific. I love that. That was actually quite quick, even though it started so young. But yeah, no, I really, and I think Tamara would be the same, really resonates with us, just seeing that joy that is sparked when you give someone advice, or you see an improvement. It's really rewarding, I guess, as a practitioner, right? Yeah, absolutely.
But yep.
I'm disappointed you left out the part where you met me.
So it was fortuitous set of events, but so you and I have always existed, or not always existed, but for a long time have now existed in really similar circles, I think, trying to achieve similar senses of purpose. And you as well, Jason, although in slightly different contexts and different ways, but that's certainly kind of the hub that brought us all together.
Absolutely. And so we met when you were with one school in Los Angeles, and then I've watched you move to other schools across the country. I've seen you doing some coaching for Stephen Kotler's team. And now you've started something new, the Antifragile Academy.
Yeah. So, you mentioned some of the things that I've done in the past and have really valued and enjoyed and taken a lot of meaning from. And those entities are not without some of their own challenges and problems. So we're at the point now with our work for the Antifragile Academy, myself and my co-founder, Dr. Adam Wright, where we're looking around and we're saying, okay, we have worked for, and served populations that know there's a lot of leverage to be had from flourishing science, well-being science, performance science, whether it's for them, whether it's for their kids, whether it's for their student athletes, whatever it might be. There's a lot to be had, but it's typically had at a cost, and that cost and the mode of delivery has made it widely inaccessible for certain populations that we think need it the most. In addition to cost and deliverability, you got some of the, as you well know, Tamara, some of the bureaucracy of trying to do it in or through schools as well. And certainly this topic isn't the only topic that has to deal with that, at least here in the States. But point being is we're looking at young populations or even adult populations who work with younger people, we'll say 15 to 25, somewhere in that adolescent range, who are seeing the same trends we're seeing, knowing that they need more information, more training, and for the most part, a lot of the institutions in place to deal with it in a reactive way. We're trying to be a bit more proactive, get in before some of the problems that we're seeing in the trends really start and take off for our young people, and see if we can equip them with skills to navigate it beforehand.
So that's what you're talking about when you say anti-fragile.
Yeah. Yep.
All
so
right.
Proactive training to develop well-being, resilience, and performance, which we think is kind of the three components of anti-fragility. The ability to not just bounce back from difficult things, but to actually thrive through them, and in some cases because of them.
That makes a ton of sense. And I know that mental toughness and anti-fragility are really being talked about more. For a long time, it was about well-being and mental health. And I think tomato, as long as we're getting to that goal of human flourishing, feeling good, functioning well, and contributing in a meaningful way. So what I'm curious to know from your perspective is when you've got young Nicks, so that 6-year-old, that 14-year-old who's now entering into their teaching career, and they want to bring some of this with them into their classrooms so that they can help students thrive in today's society. How are you going to help them do that?
I think so I will always juxtapose, I think, two really, really important pillars of flourishing science. And ironically, I think if you were to talk to traditional positive psychologists, they might refer to these as like Pos Psych 1.0 and Pos Psych 2.0. I think it's a little more complex than that. But the first one is really the well-being boost, or the power of pleasantness, or the happiness advantage, or however you want to say it, to understand that we are better at basically everything when we are generally feeling good, or in a place of general safety, homeostasis, right? Like feeling relatively secure. We'll see that in marriages. We'll see that in salaries. We'll see that in grades. We'll see that in creativity, right? And I think most people listening will understand that implicitly. Like, yeah, when I'm feeling pretty good, I do pretty well as well. Okay. That said, and this might be more interesting for your listeners who are maybe just starting to go into the classroom or looking around at this sort of, well-being pandemic, if you will, and saying, what do I do? A little more counterintuitive, but I'm telling everybody I can possibly speak to that you got to check out some of the work coming from Anna Lemke and Dopamine Nation. We all know Todd Kashdan and The Upside of Your Dark Side as well, but there's just a lot of different books. Paul Bloom, The Sweet Spot, synthesizing a lot of interesting research that basically brings us to number 2. There is some utility and unpleasantness. And we've got, I'm generalizing here, right? There's probably a wide audience. I'm mostly speaking about the US in particular. Got a lot of young people who are addicted to the pursuit of pleasure, and not in a like, hey, get off my lawn, younger generation, you're not as tough as we are sort of thing. A real neurochemical problem that they are facing, where they're locking themselves out of pleasure by pursuing it too much. So yeah, there's something to be said for that happiness advantage or that well-being boost. Embed that into your classroom and into your experiences wherever you can, however you can. But there is also something to be said for being that warm demander that can build relationships that have accountability and firmness and emotional agility and emotional intelligence.
That makes so much sense. And yet we often know that the things that seem like they have the most common sense are the things that our systems, in particular our school system, doesn't encourage. So I love that you're placing focus kind of on that whole child perspective. Makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting that you mentioned whole child, and it's part of the challenge with the schools, because when we talk about anti-fragility at TAA, we mention a 3-part framework, which is top down, bottom up, and outside in. Right. So, we can sit here and work with a young person, a coach, an adult, whoever it might be, on the top down piece, thinking about your thinking, right? Cognitive framing and flexibility and CBT and ACT and all this sort of stuff. We can also do the bottom up piece. We're learning so much about, interoceptive awareness, anatomical responses, biofeedback, sleep, nutrition, hydration, movement, all the things. But none of that happens in a vacuum. Right? It all happens in an environment, in an ecosystem. And so things that are going to happen in schools, like the classic case, I'm sure you've heard this as well. Oh, you're a flourishing school. You're a positive ed school. You're a positive psychology school. Why is Johnny getting a C? That doesn't seem very positive to me. Right? Well, no, we're talking about well-being, right? Generally, most of the time, and anti-fragility, right? Johnny's getting the C because he's procrastinating, because playing video games seems a lot more appealing than doing the calculus homework, right? And staying up late talking to the girlfriend or whatever makes a lot more sense than getting enough sleep for the test, right? That's an issue of distress tolerance, right? So I think, understanding that the environment plays a part with that top-down, bottom-up framework is really critical.
So, Nick, you've given us some examples there, I guess, of how that might translate into an educational context. But I guess this kind of started more with student athletes, did it? And then kind of translated into the educational or academic, I guess, realm?
So it's really, because of the way we frame it, well-being, resilience, and performance, we're really focusing, we say 3 E's, elite athletes, educational institutions, and executives, right? But we typically focus on those first 2 E's because they're the ones working with adolescents. So whether it's school or sport, we are looking to try to get this science and this training in a way that's very gamified, very engaging to them as early as possible. To your question, Jason, a lot of times we are getting to them through sport because, as Adam says, that's a great Trojan horse. Like there's a different thing in a school, and you had on, my colleague Sharon Russell, she might have spoken to this a bit as well. When something becomes required in a school, there's something about it that can cause it to lose some of its luster, right? And that doesn't mean it can't be effective. It just can be a little harder. As somebody who's taught, majors and minors or required classes and electives, for half of my career, there's a difference when somebody's choosing, right? Autonomously, or at least internalized.
When I think we've all seen that, Nick, where going in through the sport coaches, because the kids are attached to it. And I think the other side of that is the relationship with someone who's coaching a team often lasts multiple years rather than just one term in school.
There's probably something to be said for that, for sure. It was always long history in coaching, different dynamic with my players than my students, just because there had been more time spent. Yeah, you see them age in different ways, with them in different scenarios and situations. That's definitely a big deal. But yeah, I mean, that's, the general idea here. And you mentioned, Stephen Kotler earlier. He always says this. I think he's absolutely right, that when you're looking for people to achieve really good outcomes long term, whether that's personal health or mental health or academic, there's got to be some grittiness, right? What is grittiness? Well, it's part perseverance, which is unpleasant, but it's also part passion. And so if you can start with something that people love and are passionate about, I think you're generally going to find them more willing to engage and be gritty for the long-term commitment that is required of them if they really want to grow, right? And compound that progress.
Yeah, that absolutely speaks to me and the coach in me. And I wonder for someone who's listening to this, because I'm imagining that I'm a early career teacher who just heard us throw off all kinds of terms that they don't even understand. If we could go back to the super basics, and if you could share with our listeners something that you've tried or seen tried that you think worked really well and made a difference with a class or an individual youth.
There's two things that come to mind for early teachers, and I want to be careful here because every context is a little different, right? One, I'm going to say that I think is pretty much universal and is going to not just win you points, but it's going to build relationships. Show up to all the stuff outside of the classroom. And I don't mean every event. I don't mean every activity. But when there's something happening on or around campus, whether that's sports events, mentor or advise for a club, if you have the opportunity, spend time around a lunch area, invite groups of students in for small groups and chats, whatever it might be, but just show them you're there for more than just the content and the paycheck. Actually, really interesting research out of my alma mater, Michigan State, on this. That can be an emotional contagion. You can actually see or sense a kind of a transfer from an intrinsically or extrinsically motivated teacher to the intrinsic or extrinsic motivation of a student. So I would say be aware of that. And then the second one is stay humble and be willing to admit, and this is where I'm going to be a little careful because some classrooms and young people will take advantage of you if you don't reflect that you know what you're doing, right? And that you are bringing it each day. But you can really tip over that line quickly to where this is I'm the master of my domain and I have the answers and sage on the stage and those sorts of things. And I don't really know anyone that relates to human beings like that terribly well. So open yourself up. It's okay to have some flaws, show them you're human, laugh at yourself, laugh with them when they're laughing at you, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that being human and being humble is so important. I still remember, this is well over 20 years ago now when I was in year 12, and there was a teacher who kind of made a point of me driving erratically in the school car park, which, in hindsight was very dangerous and a stupid thing to do as a 17-year-old, but kind of singled me out in front of the class and kind of, made an example of me. But then, the next lesson he kind of had cooled down a bit and came and saw me and he apologized for the way that he'd handled it. I still remember that, over 20 years later, that, being humble, and being prepared to say, hey, maybe I didn't do that quite right.
Well, notice the dynamic in that interaction there, Jay, because I don't think the order necessarily matters, but we talked about warm demanders, the utility of unpleasantness, the happiness advantage. It sounds like he led with the unpleasantness, like, what the hell, bleeping idiot sort of guy, right? Which there's some utility in. You just said yourself, probably not the smartest thing. Like maybe it made you rethink it or stop it going forward. But then he came back and had your back the very next day, right? And tried to rebuild that relationship and brought some pleasantness. So it doesn't seem correlational that, that teacher in particular sticks out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Nick, we've all tried things though that haven't worked. Can you give an example of something that you tried and maybe had a spectacular fail? Oh, you have to think really hard about this one.
No, I mean, it's spectacular fail, depends on what you mean by spectacular. There's plenty, and that's the lesson. There's plenty of little failures along the way, especially when you're trying to do things that are maybe a bit less traditional or a little different, because you're kind of wading into newer waters. The one that sticks out to me the most, I know a lot of schools now like to try to teach neuroplasticity or the rewiring of the brain by having their students learn to juggle, right? And so I did this every year and typically like very successful. But I will say when you are a school that's completely outdoors in Los Angeles, literally with the 405 next to you and young people who, let's just be kind and say, don't have an athletic bone in their body, that means balls on the freeway. That means people who think they can't rewire their brain because they don't have hand-eye coordination. So, I try to illustrate all the concepts in actionable ways, with some of them go better than others.
Yeah. You have to, I guess, set them up for success, right?
Yes. Yep.
This comes back to our no one-size-fits-all solution that every guest talks about, that juggling is a great strategy for some, but not for everyone.
Yep. Differentiation 101.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I know that school, and I can't imagine as an adult who knows how to throw things, thinking that I wouldn't hit the 405. So. Yeah. So I'm curious. We often ask our guests how they would know if they went into a school that students were flourishing. But since you're talking in slightly different terms about anti-fragility, I want to switch the question around and say, if I walked into a school where there had been a prioritization of both the hard lessons and the gentle, so both sides, like you're talking about, how would I know when I walked into this school that this was an anti-fragile community?
The young people are getting after it, and they are driven, and they are kicking ass, but they're not doing it because they are starving for the false promise of getting into the right school or making the right salary. They're doing it because they effing love the challenge of getting better in areas that bring them meaning. And they are surrounded by faculty, friends, and family, right? That community, that outside in, that ecosystem that help hold them accountable, nudge them forward, provide useful critical feedback, the utility of that unpleasantness, but always from a position of support, right? They're doing everything we would hope a young person would do, I think, to really develop that grittiness, that perseverance, but they're doing it from an intrinsic, authentic sort of place with social support, not just because of the, rat race sort of system.
It's so interesting because as you were saying that, I was thinking that is aligned with our human nature, and it's our culture that pushes us away from that way of thinking and being. The first thing that came to my mind was the students would do that if they didn't have the parents that they have, if they didn't have the guidance counselors telling, it's all those cultural things that are out of our control.
Yep.
So yeah, absolutely outside in. Thank you for that. I love that. I'm going to grab a hold of that sentence and keep it.
Yeah, listen, I'm working with a young person right now at a school in London. You know, she's just like an absolute perfectionist, right? Brilliant as hell. It's just really hard to be anti-fragile if you think that one B plus is going to destroy your future. I mean, that is like catastrophizing, you know, in every way, shape, or form. And this is. I don't want to oversell that because there's, in many cases, far more serious problems in other different socioeconomic environments. But like the challenges are the challenges one way or another. It's all somewhat relative, right? And so when it feels this high stakes on one end or feels like nothing matters on the other end, you're at a pretty nasty place of amotivation for a lot of young people.
Hey, Nick, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Antifragility is not something that I've gone into. I've looked at each of those concepts individually, but together is really cool. And hearing you discuss it's really interesting. For our listeners, is there any resources that you would recommend, either podcasts or books, for example, for them to maybe do a deeper dive? Besides, I mean, obviously, promote your own podcast.
Sure, yeah. I've got no shame. I don't mind saying it. So I co-host Flourish FM, which is all about the science for the good life, right? So we bring in researchers, primarily scientists, in some cases philosophers as well, from all over the world, really, and basically have them break down their area of expertise, how it relates to predominant models of human flourishing, and then how they can take that research and turn it into tangible action steps, right? So that's Flourish FM. You can also check us out at the antifragileacademy.com. Thinking about additional resources, you know, I mentioned earlier Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, right? I think that one is absolutely critical. There's a long list you're welcome to check out at my website as well, but we could probably spend an entire podcast episode just going on that. So I'll leave you with one, Antifragile by Nassim Taleb, right? These really kind of coined that term. We're trying to, I think, add a bit more social science and academic credence to it and real practical and applicable ways in some cases. And so there's, you know, how this works, like, anytime you're trying to do something a little different or a little new, you've got to create and sort of invent along the way. And that's always counterintuitively, sometimes at odds with the scientific process. It feels like it should be a part of it. But start there, and then hopefully we'll keep developing stuff that will just show us more and how we can help young people wield it.
Yeah, no, I think creating the content is actually not a bad way to go. I think you can learn a lot quicker, like the traditional academic route. You know, having to publish peer-reviewed papers can take years. And so learning actually and dissemination of learnings, it actually takes quite a while to get out to the public. So we've learned so much by running the Psych Health and Safety podcast. It's a new area. Most companies that are doing it are really on the bleeding edge. So actually just talking about it and learning and then, you know, adapting based and then informing in case some research. I think it all helps. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a greater sense of urgency on getting answers to your question, which is the double-edged sword, right? Because sometimes you just take the most convenient answer. I get that. But sometimes it just pushes you to get to, at the very least, the 80-20 of the problem a lot faster, if not all the way there.
Yeah.
And Nick, I'm curious because I know you're an avid learner. Who do you listen to regularly? Who's your go-to podcast?
You know, I typically rotate, I'd say between 2 or 3. I most predominantly listen to the guy I think we all know and love, Scott Barry Kaufman and the Psychology Podcast. I just reached out to him last week. He's got I think a 4-part series on gender and sexuality from all different sorts of perspectives that I think is really interesting. And I know a lot of schools are trying to have conversations about right now. Various opinions about sort of quote unquote wellness influencers, but I love a lot of the neuroscience shared and the Huberman Lab podcast. You know, that's just absolutely blown up over the last year or two. And I think added a lot of nice neuroscience to a lot of the psychology and sociology that we had been studying and advocating. Those 2 are the primary, but I'll get in a Next Big Idea podcast or a Tim Ferriss here and there as well.
Awesome. Well, I am going to dive into some of those resources because you've absolutely shared some unique ones, which I'm always happy to have a unique recommendation. And unless there's something else that you are dying to say, I think that brings us to the end of today's episode.
No, I want to thank you both for having me, and really appreciate that you're doing the show. I think there's a place for flourishing to be talked about in pretty much every context. And, obviously you've been able to tell, and you both know me well enough that I think school is one of the most important. So having a show that speaks to doing exactly that, I think is really critical. I'm appreciative of your efforts.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Nick.
much.
Yeah.
So Jason and I always like to remind our listeners that if you're listening, you can also watch us over on the Flourish DX YouTube channel, and you'll see our beautiful faces and all our gorgeous backgrounds. And we are both hanging out on LinkedIn a lot of the time, so you can connect with us there. Nick, I know you're on LinkedIn also. You've got your website, your LinkedIn. And so I'm going to encourage our guests to connect with you as well.
Great.
And any place else they should find you.
No, just, I'm on most social, primarily LinkedIn. I mentioned the TAA website, and then, I've got my own website, but any of those will pretty much bring you to the same place. You'll be able to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Good to see you again, Jason. That's it for this episode. Until next time, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.